Now recognizes our colleague from Alabama, Mr. Palmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to go back to you, Mr. Gressman, and the point you were about to make. The President's made it clear that he doesn't plan to submit any agreement reached in Paris to the Senate. Does the position of Congress, the official position of Congress on a particular policy issue, have any bearing on whether or not the agreement requires congressional approval?
Thank you, Mr. Harrison. The answer is yes. Congress's position makes a great deal of difference, particularly in this instance, because potentially the administration, if there were some kind of binding agreement, might point to the Framework Convention, perhaps as supporting that. And were there any legal challenge over that, the first thing that courts would look to would be congressional understanding of what that is.
All right. Let me. I have a little short clip I'd like to show if the staff can put that up, that I think might bring some clarity to where Congress is on this. Can they do the video?
Most members on this committee, I think the Supreme Court came up with a very much erroneous decision on whether the Clean Air Act covers greenhouse gases. Like many of the members of this committee, I was present when we wrote that legislation, and we thought it was clear enough that it did not, that we didn't clarify it, thinking that even the Supreme Court was not stupid enough to make that finding.
Thank you.
In it,
is there any ambiguity there, Mr. Grossman?
No, there is not.
I don't think that it's an issue here in regard to the legality of what the President's doing as to whether or not we should debate this issue. Clearly, we should. I think that Congress has debated this issue. It's been pointed out that Congress brought up a cap-and-trade bill, which is arguably the same thing as the Clean Power Plan, and rejected it. It was passed by the House but rejected by the Senate, and I would like to point out that my colleagues on the Democrat side control both houses of Congress. So Congress has spoken. You just heard from a member of the Energy and Commerce Committee, I think that was in 2009, who was present as a member of Congress when the Clean Air Act was passed, and it's clear that it was never the intention of Congress to give the executive branch, through the EPA, the authority to regulate greenhouse gases. So back to your point, I think this is relevant. I think that we talk about the danger of global climate change, but I think there's another danger here that needs to be addressed, and that is the loss of the authority of Congress to make laws. So I think there's another point I want to make. Dr. Lomborg, are you familiar with a paper that was published, I think it was last year, by Dr. Philip J. Lloyd, who was one of the lead authors for the International Panel on Climate Change, and he says that he now concludes that the majority of climate change is the result of natural variation. Are you familiar with that?
No, I'm not, sir.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to enter this abstract into the record, if we may do so.
Without objection.
Thank you. I think that if climate change is predominantly the result of natural variation, I think it would logic would require us to put as much emphasis on dealing with the consequences of climate change as a result of natural variation, maybe even more so as the science continues to evolve on this, than spending enormous amounts of money and resources on human activities. Would you agree with that, Dr. Lomborg? It's a yes or no.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. I think to you, Dr. Steer, and your comments about forcing people into smaller and smaller environments and living spaces and changing their cultures and how they live reminds me of a book that came out in 1978 by a guy named Clarence B. Carson, The World in the Grip of an Idea, and his point, if I may simplify it, is basically that there's always this great idea out there that empowers government to do things that people don't want it to do. And in this case, it's achieving human progress through saving the planet and focusing everyone's efforts on that and using government power as the instrument to achieve that end. My time has expired. I yield, Mr. Chairman.